Alexandria Neason is a writer whose work has appeared in multiple outlets, including The Village Voice. And we're talking actually about a piece that she wrote in 2019. The story has gotten, officials say in Chicago and elsewhere, police departments plant misinformation to the press. And it was published in the Columbia Journalism Review. Alexandria, are you there?
I'm here.
We can't, and it's no problem if you don't want to. Oh, great. Okay, your video's on. You totally anticipated that. So you wrote this piece in 2019, basically about how police are, essentially favored by the press in terms of their accounts of killings, of brutality, that they are able to set the narrative. And I want to get to this, and you have some very specific stories that we need to get to that you reported on, obviously. But in the last couple of weeks, we've seen police shoot rubber bullets at reporters, including, watching this reporter from German cable news just sort of trying to set a shot in Minneapolis. He's getting shot. We've seen reporters from really a very wide array of news outlets being attacked. And obviously, there's nothing, reporters' lives and well-being are not more important than anybody else. But it does actually show significant, along with everything else they've been doing the last couple of weeks, the specific action of attacking reporters is very brazen and not something that they're, trying to hide in any way, shape, or form. So I'm just wondering, with your history of reporting on this, what do you make of that level of aggressiveness that you've seen from them specifically towards the press? And do you, obviously it's going to change some attitudes, but how far reaching do you think those experiences for the press could be in having police attack them while they're doing their jobs?
I think the last couple of years we've seen the press sort of have to weather verbal attacks from the highest rungs of government. And I think that's been a wide range, a conversation that has been happening in the press and in our newspapers and our airwaves for the last couple of years. And so there's certainly a heightened attention being paid to that in terms of freedoms of the press and what our constitutional rights are. With this escalating to physical violence, certainly this is not the first time. I think that there are reporters working particular beats here and abroad who have always been subject to violence, to physical violence. Seeing it happen domestically and in such a widespread way, I think has been jarring for some folks, readers and the public and reporters alike. In terms of changing attitudes, I think you made the point that the safety of a journalist is not more important than the safety of anybody walking down the street. But I think that what we're likely to see, or what we are seeing, is that folks are sort of using physical attacks on the press as a means by which they can get people who previously didn't care about similar attacks on general members of the public, particularly people from certain marginalized communities, to sort of get them to care, to wake them up. It's the sort of, it's the argument that if it's happening, to reporters while they're live on CNN, then think about what might be happening to people when there are no cameras around, or to people who don't enjoy the prominence of being a national reporter. And so I think that there's a sort of awareness spreading that it's not just about what it means when the police are physically violent with the press when they're outside trying to do their jobs, but also what that suggests about the larger institution of policing and the violence that people in communities all over the country experience every day.
And this piece goes into really a very extended history of this relationship between basically the press almost being like a PR department for the police, which I want us to get into. But can you start by telling us the story, and this is how you begin your piece, of Joshua Beale?
Sure. So Joshua Beale is a man from Indianapolis who in the fall of 2016 was in Chicago for a relative's funeral. And there was a car procession leaving a cemetery in a neighborhood called Mount Greenwood in Chicago. And Mount Greenwood is a neighborhood that is predominantly white in a city in which the majority of the population are people of color. And it's in particular notable because it's home to many of the city's cops and firefighters. And there's a cemetery there. They were leaving the cemetery after having buried a relative, and there was this sort of altercation on the street. And basically, a car cut off some of the vehicles that were in the funeral procession. And an argument began. People got out of their cars. And what happened was that two narratives quickly emerged. Joshua Beale got out of his car, and there were two men who later we found out were police officers, off-duty police officers. And there was sort of a lot of chaos. There was loud music, there was a lot of yelling, and this argument very quickly escalated. And there were dozens of 911 calls made from the scene in which bystanders were describing two white men waving guns around. And Joshua Beale, who was legally licensed to carry a firearm, retrieved his firearm from his car. And, minutes later, he was dead in the street. And very quickly, two separate narratives emerged from this scene. There was the police narrative, and then there was what his family said and what bystanders said. The police said that what had happened were two officers, Joseph Treacy and Thomas Darrowan, were off duty and sort of happened upon this. Joseph Treacy got into an argument. There was, the police said that someone had been blocking a fire lane and that's how the argument had began. Notably, the police said that Joshua Beale had fired his weapon first and that they had returned fire. And they also said that both Darrowan and Treacy were in uniform and obviously law enforcement. This was not reflected in any of the 911 calls that came from bystanders, and the family who was there insisted that it was not clear at all that they were law enforcement. And so what you had is the police saying that they were justified in shooting and killing him because it was obvious that they were police and that he made the decision not to lower his weapon, and everyone else saying that these were just two angry white guys in the street waving guns and that Joshua Beale brought his firearm out in self-defense in response to them having pulled a gun first. And what happened is that reporters get to the scene and they start to write these stories and they start to speak to the communications representatives who represent the Chicago Police Department. And those details about the officers being in uniform, about Beale having pulled his weapon first, they start to leak into the stories that are written and that appear in local news media. And the detail about the cops having been in uniform in particular really spread. And it sort of started with Anthony Guglielmi, who's the chief communications officer for the Chicago Police Department, telling that to reporters. The police chief also repeated this to reporters. It appears on the nightly news and in local newspapers. It was also in the autopsy report. And then months later, 911 calls are released, and the family sort of from day one had always insisted that no, they weren't in uniform and nobody had any idea who these people were. And so you started to see this spread and spread and spread, and it wasn't challenged, by reporters until months and months and months later. This came, just 2 years after the city of Chicago had erupted in protest over the murder of Laquan Mcdonald. And so it was a familiar scene where, a Black man is killed by police and the police say one thing happened and everyone else says that something else happened. Maya Dukmasova, who is a local reporter for the Chicago Reader, she wrote a piece 18 months later examining the misinformation, particularly that the officers were in uniform, and sort of detailed why that hadn't been challenged by reporters, even as through the course of the investigation of this incident, sort of began to reveal more and more that this was just a blatant lie.
And then the Laquan Mcdonald case, they put out a complete misrepresentation of his murder, and the only reason, that was cleared because videotape, which they had suppressed, actually got released to the public.
Right. And so that, with Laquan Mcdonald, the story was that the officer was justified in shooting and killing him because he had been holding a knife and had lunged at reporters. And then, reporters filed, over a dozen freedom of information requests to release the tape that would show what actually happened, and all of them were denied. The police department's line was that releasing it would interfere with their ability to conduct a proper investigation. And so an investigative report, the only reason it was released was because an investigative reporter sued the city and the department, and a judge sided with the reporter. And so the tape was released. And what we all know now is that, what the police said happened just never happened. And in fact, that officer, Jason Van Dyke, was later arrested and convicted. And it was also found that there were other officers who misrepresented and deliberately fabricated information about what happened in that moment with Laquan Mcdonald. So there was a history already that even extends beyond Laquan Mcdonald of the Chicago Police Department and many other police departments of things like this happening.
Yeah, you go in incredible. This one of the great things about this piece is it really is a history. And I'm going to quote, and specifically I'll quote from you, and you can start, maybe tell us also about the divergence of basically the origins and essentially Black media of attempting to actually tell, at least a fully filled out narrative for all of these kinds of stories going back to the 1830s. I think the 1830s. And you basically say, and I'm sorry, I lost my place here. But basically that in modern American police departments emerged in the 1830s out of a desire to control, quote unquote, disorder in growing cities, starting with Boston, New York City followed, then Albany, then Chicago. Police officers were offered steady full-time employment, supported by public funds, had a broad mandate to define what, quote unquote, disorder meant. And they were valorized by American culture, including in the mainstream press. Crime stories provided great heroes' tales and horror dramas to sell newspapers. In the eyes of people from marginalized communities, the press was an ally of police who were enforcers of white supremacy. And then you take us into the story of Emmett Till. Can you just, in any way you want, really fill out that history for us? And specifically with that angle of how different parts of the press are covering this and presenting this.
Sure. So the earliest examples of what we now call police departments, their primary characteristics, according to historians, were in fact corruption and brutality. So it's interesting to consider how we frame conversations about modern police brutality now. You hear police unions and other folks sort of talk about police brutality like it's an exception to the rule, the whole concept of a bad apple amongst mostly good ones, which is just plainly ahistorical. Gary Potter, who's a historian at Eastern Kentucky University, says that from day one, the police departments were notoriously corrupt and notoriously brutal in their handlings with the public. And like everything in this country, white supremacy is sort of the underlying current that drove American policing. And so, particularly as Black people began to, earn or fight for more extended rights in this country, you started to see a lot of different institutions mobilize in overt and covert ways to suppress that. And one of the ways that they have done that in terms of curtailing the freedoms that Black people were pushing for is through policing. One of the biggest ways that they were helped by that was through mainstream press that was run largely by white people. And so you saw in reporting on the Black community, a lot of stereotypes, outright racism, people who should not have been given space in newspapers were given space. And the case of Emmett Till is a really good example of that. So when Emmett Till was murdered, you saw white newspapers in the South. Their reporting on this sort of offered a benefit of the doubt to the police and to the men who were accused. That was inappropriate. They were running stories that were quoting sheriffs that were making wild accusations, like the entire thing was fabricated by the NAACP. They were focusing intensely on the alleged infraction as though that was justification for his brutal murder. You saw headlines that said things like "Wolf Whistle Boy," and so all of this, helped the public sort of excuse what had happened. And so the Black press has always played a role in sort of countering those narratives. And I think that, there's some criticism that the mainstream would lodge at the Black press and say that, well, these are advocates, these are not real reporters, it's not real journalism, when in fact they were just telling the whole truth, the actual truth, because we couldn't rely on mainstream newspapers to do so. And if you move through history, you see examples of this happening all the time, up until, the modern times, where we've got this sort of cushy relationship between journalists and police departments who previously relied on them as sources of information. One of the big problems is that journalists had to maintain, they had to be sort of in good favor with police officers so that they could rely on them to feed them information so that they could write stories. And so what you saw is that it was rare that you would see stories about police corruption, anything that would make police departments look bad. That did start to shift. When I was reporting on this story, I talked with a veteran New York reporter named Jim Mulvaney, and he talked about how, early in his career, when he was covering cops in New York City, he would show up to the precinct with a box of donuts and, we put the donuts out and say, okay, guys, tell me what's going on. And he was talking to street cops. Watergate happened, and he attributes the shift as happening post-Watergate, where there was a renewed interest in investigative journalism focused specifically on institutional corruption. And then you start to see police departments close ranks. And so it was much, much harder for reporters to be talking with the police officers who were actually on the street in neighborhoods. And you started to see them refer journalists to public information officers. And so you have sort of the birth of the modern communications teams that are now present at every police department. And those teams function ostensibly as, an arm of transparency, the middleman between the department and the public, when in practice, they're public relations teams. And so, their function is, in, Jim Mulvaney's words, is to make the cops look good. And so you sort of have, and so it was like, we've always had an issue with the way that the press and, the larger American culture valorizes cops as heroes and good guys and out fighting the good fight. That compounds into the problem of a communications department that exercises broad control over information about how the police interact with the public. So now journalists are having to deal with an inability to actually get the information that we need to do the reporting that has to be done.
Yeah, and so that starts to parallel this whole problem across journalism that you talk about, of just like slashing budgets, not enough funds to do investigative reporting of any kind. And it reminded me, actually, in a really different context, but a friend of mine was working to expand Medicaid in a very red state. And, he was saying, like, you still actually do have small newspapers that exist in little towns in a way that probably, people who live in major cities don't think of in the same way anymore. And you're talking about like maybe one person works at this newspaper, maybe two. And, Koch brothers network has an organizer for that part of the state who can give them a free op-ed, who can give them, their version of stats really easily. So that was another thing that I got in the modern iteration from your piece, that it kind of tracks everything, that there was this wave of we need to interrogate policing like everything else. The Nixon administration, potentially corporate power, whatever. And now there's just this like broad base of decline while police have major PR infrastructure in place.
Yeah, the other thing that is really troubling that is happening at the same time as newsrooms are losing reporters and losing funding and in some cases totally shuttering outlets altogether. Police departments, their communications teams have become increasingly sophisticated and in fact sometimes are hiring their own reporters to work on behalf of the police department. So now they're sort of where before they were sort of controlling information released to the press. They're now in some cases saying, well, we don't have to release information to the press at all because we can devise our own, quote, newsroom and control the flow of information in that way, which is troubling.
Do you think there's so many elements of this, but people, are talking about all sorts of various questions of regulation, defunding, reinvesting, different legal decisions, civil rights packages. Do you think there's like a specific room for, particularly with public money, like regulating PR departments or trying to introduce transparency in that area?
I think that it certainly should be a public priority to be looking at ways that we can bolster, existing and new newsrooms who are dedicated to this beat. I'm not sure what it would look like to regulate, a communications team that operates inside of a police department. But if we consider the ways in which our laws protect police departments generally, it's difficult to envision a legislative fix for that. A lot of the information that reporters need and try to get access to do their jobs now has been shielded. In New York, for example, and this was just repealed the other day, but there's a 40-year-old law that kept disciplinary records of police officers from public scrutiny. And so that has been, a major roadblock for reporters, especially in writing stories about police brutality. And so we are in this sort of moment of shift where politicians and certainly the public are really pushing back against things like that and saying, we need increased transparency and you can't keep this stuff from the public. So maybe there's room in there for something. I'm not sure what it might look like to specifically, in a legislative way, hold the communications teams, I guess, accountable for the ways in which they handle this information.
Yeah, I'm wondering if they're hiring outside firms as an example. It's just like there's a lot of, you see this in so many areas of essentially like public funds getting used to allocate to do propaganda for, areas of the government that are abusing the public. I agree with you, though. It's probably very difficult to regulate, but something we need to know about. And this piece goes into. So now is like the general, wrap up question. Like you wrote this piece in 2019. We've had this incredible wave of uprisings that are going to manifest in, so many different ways. What in any direction do you want to go? Like, what do you see happening now? What's your feeling now as pertains, particularly, I think, to this article and kind of pushing back against essentially, PR from police departments, whatever else you think is important to touch on?
I think one of the big takeaways for journalists in particular, I think, is that even for journalists who have been trying to do good work on this beat, I think there's this sort of reckoning where we're all considering the ways in which we have contributed to this problem, and not just the problem of misinformation being spread via our stories, but really looking at how we do our jobs. So when something happens and we show up, who are the first people that we talk to? Often it's the police. Even reporters who understand that there's sort of like it's been demonstrated by their own experience that the police often lie. And I think that there's this sort of examination of American culture that American journalism is not exempt to, where we give police departments the benefit of the doubt, where there's a sort of regard for authority that seeps into how we conduct our reporting. And it doesn't really matter whether it's intentional or not. The reality is that it happens. And I think that what we're seeing is people really starting to sort of take stock of that in a significant way at the demands of the public. And so it's not just that, we've spent days and days and days watching the cops beat people up on the street. It's also, readers saying, look at how you cover this. Let's consider the language that we use. There's been a lot of really good criticism that looks at, how we describe the protests of the last 2 weeks. What do we really mean when we're using words like chaos or rage or riot or looters? And how does that contribute? How does that contribute to this larger problem of, even with the evidence right in our faces, continuing to sort of make space for the possibility that the behavior of the police is justified. And I think that people are starting to really take a look at the ways that we contribute to this every day.
It's a really, really good piece. Officials say, and of course you can also read more of Alexandria's work in the Columbia Journalism Review. But Alexandria Neason, I really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.